The black elites of the antebellum period were African Americans who had a high status and lots of success. African Americans could achieve this success through talent, wealth, occupation, family connections, complexion, and education. In addition, the elite was very important as they helped develop black institutions and culture, and they also supported the anti-slavery movement. They also helped the black community and sympathetic white people come together. By the 1820s, the black elite was becoming better educated and more socially polished. However, regardless of their status, they were treated as inferior. For example, complexion played a role in determining one's social status. African Americans who had a lighter complexion than those with dark complexions were better off in terms of beauty and employment. However, many African Americans struggled financially whether or not they had a dark or light complexion. However, there were some African Americans who did manage to make it to the top as entrepreneurs. A notable example of this is Stephen Smith and his partner William Whipper. Smith, born a slave in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, became the manager of a lumber business during his late teens and bought his freedom in 1816. Before he became Whipper's partner, Whipper was working as a steam scourer in Philadelphia during the 1920s. He also opened a grocery store in 1834. The two men eventually became partners in 1835. They had a lot of success even though there was a mob attack on their office that same year. They had one of the largest lumbering businesses in southeastern Pennsylvania and eventually started selling coal. In addition, Smith at one point owned 52 brick houses in Philadelphia. He was probably the richest African American during the antebellum era. By 1860, he owned a real estate in Lancaster and Philadelphia, which was worth $23,000, and that is about $420,000 current dollars. Not only were Whipper and Smith entrepreneurs, they were also supporters of the anti-slavery cause. Whipper used his grocery store for anti-slavery activities, and both of them engaged in Underground Railroad activities. Other successful African American entrepreneurs who supported the anti-slavery cause were Lewis Hayden, Henry Boyd, and James Forten. Lewis Hayden was born as a slave, but he managed to escape and eventually came to run a successful clothing store in Boston by 1849. His home was a stop for the Underground Railroad, and he also protected fugitive slaves. For example, in 1850, he assisted William and Ellen Craft, a fugitive slave couple from Georgia. Henry Boyd in the 1840s and 50s built and operated a steam-powered furniture factory in Cincinnati. And James Forten of Philadelphia was born free and became the owner of his own business in 1798. He advocated for equal rights and abolition.
A class of black professionals rose due to the segregated neighborhoods. These professionals included ministers, undertakers, physicians, and lawyers who exclusively served black clients. In addition, black merchants gained wealth by selling to black communities. One example of a successful African American doctor was James McCune Smith. He attended the University of Glasgow. After he graduated, he became the first African American to obtain a medical degree, which he obtained in 1837. He was also the first African American to run a pharmacy in the United States. He used his training and knowledge in medicine to refute misconceptions about race, intelligence, and society. In December 1846, Smith was appointed physician to the Colored Orphan Asylum. However, this required him to take the railroad system, but he was denied access because of his race. The director of the asylum stepped in to convince the railroad company to allow him access due to outbreak of measles and paid for his travels. After the passing of the Fugitive Slave Law, Smith helped resist it by helping slaves by the use of the Underground Railroad. In 1853, Smith, with help of Frederick Douglass, started the National Council of Colored People. It was the first permanent national organization for blacks. Either because they had been forced out of medical school or they chose not to go, other prominent black physicians practiced medicine without having earned a degree, which was legal in the 19th century. James Still of Medford was one of these people. He became a very prominent herbalist. His cough bomb, which was created from plants and herbs grown on his farm, gained him lots of success. Some notable African Americans of the antebellum era who practiced law were John S. Rock, Robert Morris, and Malcolm B. Allen. John S. Rock was also a prominent speaker for abolition and was the first African American to be admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1861. Robert Morris became one of the first black lawyers in the United States after being admitted to Massachusetts bar in 1847. McCune Bowling Allen is believed to be the first black man to hold a judiciary position and have license to practice law. By 1844, Allen had acquired enough proficiency that Fessenden told the Portland District Court he thought Allen should be able to practice as a lawyer. He was refused on the grounds that he was not a citizen, though, according to Maine law, anyone of good moral character could be admitted to the bar. After passing the exam, he was declared a citizen of Maine and given his license to practice law on July 3, 1844. Finding work in Maine, however, was difficult. There were few blacks there willing and able to hire Allen, and most whites were unwilling to have a black man represent them in court. Eventually, he moved to Boston and passed the Massachusetts bar exam on May 5, 1845. He and Robert Morris Jr. opened the first black law office in the United States, and in 1848 he passed another exam to become Justice of the Peace for Middlesex County, Massachusetts.
During the antebellum period, many African Americans wrote literature that showed how America did not live up to its revolutionary ideals of liberty and freedom. For example, in 1855, William C. Nell's The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, published in 1855, reminded people that African American men fought for freedom in the Revolutionary War. African Americans also wrote narratives, histories, novels, and poetry. One of the most famous slave narratives during the time was Frederick Douglass's classic Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, published in 1845.
One famous quote from this slave narrative is, "Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The songs of the slave represent the sorrows of his heart, and he is relieved by them, only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears."
Other notable works of literature, specifically novels, were made by William Wells Brown, Martin R. Delaney, and Harry E. Wilson. William Wells Brown escaped slavery in Kentucky and became the first African American novelist. He published Clottel, or the President's Daughter, in 1853. His novel explored the moral consequences of slaveholders fathering children from their slaves by using the affair between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
Brown once said, "All I demand for the black man is that white people shall take their heels off his neck and let him have a chance to rise by his own efforts."
Martin R. Delaney's Blake, or The Huts of America, was a story about Southern slaves developing an understanding of the revolutionary ideals of freedom. It ran as a serial in the weekly Anglo-African newspaper during 1859. Harriet E. Wilson was the first black woman in the U.S. to publish a book. She published Our Nick, or Sketches from the Life of a Free Black, in a 2-story White House North in 1859. However, her novel received little attention. It was until the 1980s that she started gaining attention, but with critics believing a white author had written it. Other African American women who published fiction was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She was born free in Baltimore in 1825. She supported the anti-slavery cause and published poems that depicted the harsh brutality slaves had to face. Her first collection of poems appeared in 1854. It was called Poems on Various Subjects. Another black poet was George M. Horton. He was a North Carolina slave who published The Hope of Liberty in 1829. In addition to black authors, black artists such as Edmonia Lewis also supported the anti-slavery cause through their art. Lewis was the first African American sculptor. Her work portrayed themes about African Americans and eventually became very famous after the Civil War. Robert S. Duncanson, another black artist, was considered to be the most accomplished African American painter during the antebellum era. The largest and most important commission in Duncanson's career was a series of murals he painted for Nicholas Longworth, a political leader and abolitionist, between 1848 and 1850. Patrick Reason, a less well-known black artist, was an engraver and created portraits of abolitionists during the 1830s. Unlike Lewis, Duncanson, and Reason, other black artists such as Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield used their voice to create art. Greenfield was born a slave in Mississippi, but was raised by Quakers in Philadelphia. She was a singer known as the Black Swan and was renowned for her vocal range. In 1853, she traveled to Europe with Harriet Beecher Stowe's help. Greenfield was soon performing for the English elite.